Hello and welcome to the IOSH podcast. These episodes will feature exclusive interviews with industry experts, behind-the-scenes discussions with members, and conversations with future leaders of the health and safety profession. In this episode, IOSH magazine editor Joanne Perry sits down with Neil Carberry, CEO of the Recruitment and Employment Confederation, to discuss the results of our recent health and safety salary survey.
We're here today to talk about the results of our recent salary survey within the health and safety profession, for which we received over 2,700 responses. Tell us a bit about yourself and your work as Chief Executive of the Recruitment and Employment Confederation.
Well, hi, Joe. It's a real pleasure to be with you to talk about the survey and, what a great response rate. My career, essentially, I'm kind of a labour market geek. I started as a recruiter. I worked at the CBI for a long time, including at one point as head of health and safety policy. And now I've been the chief executive of the REC for the last 6 years. The REC is the UK's professional and sector body for recruitment and staffing and talent businesses. So very much a sort of IOSH for recruiters and staffing professionals.
REC is a lot easier to say than the Recruitment and Employment Confederation, so I'm going to use REC from now on. So tell us a little bit about the recruitment market and is it recovering from what happened during the pandemic? What's the situation at the moment?
So I think when we think about recruitment, you think about it as pro-cyclical in a way that sort of health and safety is counter-cyclical. You always need to make sure you're looking after your health and safety. Businesses do recruitment align with their growth patterns. So if the economy is growing, we grow a bit more than the economy. And if the economy is shrinking, we tend to shrink a little bit more. What we've seen since the pandemic is clearly there was a Monday morning in March 2020 where the whiteboards in the entire industry just cleared because people didn't sign up for anything. That actually bounced back quite quickly. It's worth setting out that in recruitment, 80% of the revenue of the industry comes from temporary work, which, if you think about it, you understand, which is if you place someone in a permanent job, that's one fee, one off. Whereas if you place someone as a temp, they are your employee and it's an ongoing fee. And we found that temporary work actually recovered quite quickly in the summer of 2020. Permanent recruitment recovered a bit slower, really waited until the end of the third lockdown before it picked up pace. And then in 2021 into 2022, we had a recruitment market the like of which I have never seen, and people who've been in the market much longer than I have never seen. A real scrabble for resources as people tried to get up to speed. You remember we had lots of talk of a general skills and labour shortage. Elements of that still persist in engineering, in some blue-collar logistics and factory work. But broadly, what we've seen in the last year to year and a half is permanent work starting to slow down again as opportunities dry up. And temporary work has been pretty flat, resilient, still quite high levels, but just starting to fall away as well in our data for March this year. What I think we're seeing now is, having turned everything off and then turned it all back on again and panicked, companies are looking at, well, what's my future production model? What do I need? And how do I make decisions about that right now in an era of high economic uncertainty? You look around the world at the number of elections this year. I was in the US 2 weeks ago. If you look at the conference board scoring of what people are worried about, the presidential election is top of that by miles. Here in the UK, I think we're in a bit of a holding pattern until we have the general election. We're waiting for interest rates to come down. So at the moment, we're still seeing temporary work quite strong, but there's been that drop-off in demand for permanent work. I think we think it's bottomed out now, but we're waiting for some clearer economic signals before it takes off again. Still broadly quite a good time to be looking for work because the UK labour market is so tight. We're going to talk about that, I'm sure, but not where we were 18 months ago, which was real boom time.
Yeah, they're not the only ones worried about the US election. It's quite an interesting situation, isn't it?
Well, I think the theme of my conversations with colleagues in the US staffing industry is there isn't actually a good outcome. What American business is looking for is a kind of classic center ground Democrat or Republican candidate under the age of 70. And that's not an ageist comment, but you're looking at two people who've both done a term as president before, and they come with a lot of baggage. I think that sense of a need to break from that duopoly, it was very clear talking to US business leaders the other week.
Yeah. I do find it strange that in a country with, 240 million people, these are the two candidates that America's found. But anyway, that's a whole separate episode.
Well, and there's a whole political thing in
there is.
It used to be that European political leaders were older and American political leaders were younger, and we've swapped completely. If you look at one of the reasons that a Labour victory in this year's election might personally be good news for Carberry is that I'd like the Prime Minister to be older than me again. But you look at the new Taoiseach who's being elected in Ireland. You look at Emmanuel Macron, who's coming to the end of his term in office and is still relatively young historically. There's been a real kind of gap emerge between the two nations, between the US and European nations.
Interesting stuff. Recruitment of political leaders. We can have another episode on that. So just previously you mentioned temporary work. Did your comments include the gig economy? Because that has been something that has grown up increasingly over the past years and probably has come back a bit now or even increased during the pandemic when people needed deliveries. What was going on with the gig economy? So
platform-based work has grown significantly generally. And one of the challenges for us as a professional body is explaining to policymakers that a job doesn't change its nature just because you find it on a platform. One of the big challenges for the REC is actually to make the point that agency work and temporary work more broadly in the UK is actually really well regulated. We've got an act of similar vintage to the Health and Safety at Work Act, actually, the Employment Agencies Act 1973, which regulates the industry. We've got a set of conduct regs, so it's a heavily regulated industry in the favour of the worker with lots of protection, and if it's well enforced, works well. What we don't want to see broadly as gig work picks up, and I think people do want that level of flexibility, as a decent slice of the labour market wants that flexibility. We need to make sure that we protect people who are working in that way. We've seen too many examples of apps popping up that claim not to be agencies, what we call in law employment businesses, but who clearly are. So there's a lot of work to do to make sure people are protected in the gig economy, and I think agency work's a big part of that.
Mm-hmm. So another trend that we're seeing, obviously, is the tendency towards remote work and hybrid work. What are your thoughts on that?
Fascinating that Europe broadly seems to be a lot more back in the office than the US. And the UK is probably sitting in the middle between the two. If I talk to client businesses of our members, so employers around the country, I think it rather depends on where you are. So if you've got an office on the edge of a business park in a county town somewhere, people tend to be back a bit more than if you've got an office in central London. And clearly there's lots of manufacturing and utility and healthcare work that has always had to be done in person. It's always worth remembering that even in March and April 2020, most people still went to work every day. And there's a live question there for people like health and safety professionals, like internal recruiters and HR professionals who are supporting industries. Is the point Neil Morrison, HR director of Severn Trent, makes. If he's got people out fixing drains at midnight, possibly he wants his HR team to come into the office. So I think each business is trying to make its own path based on where it is and the sector it supports. Inside recruitment, I would say that most businesses outside London are back 3 to 4 days a week in. In London, it's more like 2 to 3.
Mm-hmm. I think, things have changed significantly. And every time I come into London, I remember when I was working in London and I was going to an office every single day and struggling through the tube system and all the public transport issues that you get. And now to work from home the majority of the time, it's such a change. And And also there are implications in terms of health and safety, because then, where are the liabilities if I'm working from home and I have an accident? And all these things are, they've changed, and it's something that we need to think about. And from the look of things, the situation of hybrid work, this is something that workers, really quite enjoy. So it seems likely to continue.
So I think there are huge health and safety implications of this change and huge labour market implications of this change. And what recruiters would say to me right now when they talk to clients and candidates is that neither side seems to have processed where we are now. So candidates tend to be in the view that we're still in 2020, 2021, 2022, and I want full remote and can't possibly ever go into the office. On the flip side, lots of clients, lots of hiring companies think, well, we've had a small recession. The labour market must be loosening, and therefore we can make greater demands. And actually, you've got to find that middle ground. And that middle ground involves thinking through hybrid work not as a benefit or as an emergency measure, as it was during the pandemic, but as a mode of production. And I think for health and safety leaders, you mentioned the physical risk of accidents in the home. And clearly there's a whole thing with MSDs in terms of people's home working stations. The worst example I came across during the first lockdown was someone who was working on their parents' ironing board because both of their parents were in the house working from home as well. And that was the space that could be established for them. There is a whole suite of things there, but I think increasingly the big thing in the health and safety world that is on the majority of employers' minds is mental health. And I think you look at the survey data, lots of two biggest groups are in manufacturing and construction, very traditional capital H parts of the industry. I think that and capital S. I think this piece around health is really important. Not a number of discussions with business leaders recently about people say they want to be at home more. But I know that isolates them and that they end up feeling worse and it contributes to mental health issues. So how do we have a sensible discussion with people that having you in the office a couple of days or 3 days a week or whatever it is not about me wanting to stand over your shoulder and check what you're doing. It's about building the connections that enable you to be productive for us, but also the relationships that enable you to disseminate those down moments before they build up into something more significant. One of the great bits of work that Bruce Daisley pointed to in his book was about call centre workers, and call centre workers working on their own. If they have a bad call, their productivity struggles for much longer than if they have a bad call. If they're working in a group, they have their tea break together, they talk it out with their colleagues and they go back on. And I think those group dynamics thinkings about mental health feel really important.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because having other people around, it sort of helps you keep perspective and things are less intense. Something else that was in the news recently was about the number of young people with mental health issues and the number of people who are out of work partly because of those issues. And yet at the same time, it seems that quite a few of the younger generations, they're interested in working from home because unlike people who've spent decades going to an office, they're much more into this kind of hybrid or remote working. So those two things are actually happening at the same time, aren't they?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of big themes there. One is about, let's not assume that young people who were in school and college and university during the pandemic and basically missed 2 years of their social development are going to jump back immediately. There is a higher level of anxiety, not just driven by the pandemic, but, the always-on culture that they've adapted to. They're digital natives in the way that perhaps you and I got a smartphone when we were already adults and dealt with it in those terms. There's much less in the way of support for young people as well. I mean, child and adolescent mental health services in large parts of the country have largely evaporated. Which means that there is more weight coming, more work to do. And schools are certainly feeling that too in terms of early years, team around the family stuff. most primary schools have seen a significant increase in their SEN load over the last few years, and it is this kind of thing. So there's lots of work to do to support young people. As businesses, the thing that we need to understand is that we can build our workforce, we can invest in our workforce, but that requires us to think about entry points. I'll probably come back to this point, but I think it's really important to make it up front. We've gone from a world up to 2016 where actually the British labour market was quite loose. And Brexit's part of this, but it's not the main story. The main story, and I think you see it in the survey data in terms of the demographics of the workforce in safety and health, is it is huge demographic change. My favourite stat that I throw in all the time is once you understand that 50% more babies were born in Britain in 1964 than 1977, you understand everything you need to know about the British labour market. The baby boom generation is big. It has been a benefit to the UK economy while it's in the labour force, now passing out of the labour force and being replaced by smaller generations. The UK labour force is now tight in a way that it hasn't been for 20 or 30 years. So businesses need to bear that in mind when thinking about how you source talent. And we talk about thinking more strategically about talent, thinking more strategically about career plans, and that triangle of what am I going to buy? I'm going to go out and I'm going to hire a health and safety manager who's experienced in another firm, and I know I'm going to have to pay for it, versus what am I going to build? I'm actually going to go out and find some young people and I'm going to train them up to do this stuff. And I'm going to know they're not going to be plug and play solutions for us, but they're more likely to stay a bit longer and they will get there, versus what am I going to borrow? I know these resources are in short supply and therefore I'm bringing them in on a temporary basis. And I think British businesses have not been strategic enough in thinking about workforce planning because they haven't had to be for 20 or 30 years. That has changed now. So when we talk in a rather hackneyed way about the balance of power between workers and employers, I think it's actually more about people being in shorter supply in the UK labour market and thinking about, well, how do you give people good paths? And that, of course, colours then what do you offer them in terms of flexible work, and how do you respond to what they're asking for? It's why the kind of data the surveys gathered is really important.
Given that people can now work remotely, theoretically, you could actually recruit somebody from outside the UK who is still living and working outside the UK. So the world really is this ginormous talent pool. Do you see interest in recruiting people who are still living abroad?
Yes. Great stat that I picked up the other week. 40% of platform-based projects put up on platforms like Fiverr globally are come out of the US. Only 5% of them are done in the US. So that you see that nearshoring, particularly US looking very much to Latin America as a potential source of support. I think we see the same trends in the UK. There are big complexities with that, most notably around making sure you're tax compliant. So we're seeing things like employer of record, which is a kind of technical term that allows you develop to allow you to employ people in another jurisdiction. Of course, more complex now because you have to have that for European countries as well. By and large, I still think that kind of offshoring is a minority sport. And I think it tends to be more to do with big project work than about critical things in the line, where I think putting people in front of colleagues is still important.
I was just picking up some useful tips when I moved to Italy.
Well, I'm nothing if not envious.
That's just a dream, but it may happen. I mean, time difference isn't too bad, is it?
No. Well, I think we have seen one of the things we have seen post-pandemic is people who moved in the pandemic and didn't tell their employers, and then you have a discussion of, well, how can this job be done from where you are? And by and large, it rather depends on the legal base of the country that the person is in at that time. For example, you may not want to employ someone in France, but French law precludes you taking on someone as a self-employed service provider who's previously done that job for you as an employee. So getting across the details of the law in different countries is really important.
So let's start to look at the survey results. As I mentioned before, we had over 2,700 responses from health and safety professionals, which was an amazing sample. So you've had a sneak peek at the results. In general, what interested you, what surprised you, and what's your take on it?
So I think probably one thing that I felt was confirmed by the survey that I think is a reason for concern and action. And then one thing that surprised me. The thing that was confirmed, I think, is you see a picture of the industry in the survey that speaks to some of what we've already discussed about generations. So the biggest groups are in construction and in manufacturing, so big capital S safety sectors. They are, on balance, there's a drift towards the older end of the age profile. Question mark whether the next generation of safety and health in the UK probably needs to have more age and needs to be more visible in other sectors, as well as kind of high safety critical sectors. So there's a whole piece there about, well, is the production model of good safety and health professionals, not the IOSH standards or anything like that, but actually the entry into the pipeline. Do we have a challenge there, especially since the pressure in businesses has been to automate, to simplify, and being a health and safety leader is a bit like being the industrial relations guy. And I say this because I was the industrial relations guy. But for about 30 years in British business, chief execs have been happy to see everyone from HR except the industrial relations guy, because when you turn up, there's a problem. And there's a little bit of that in in health and safety. There's this big red button that you have in industrial relations, and you also have in health and safety. And very efficiency, production focused exec leaderships really don't like it being pressed, but sometimes you have to press it. I think there's a piece about voice and developing the safety and health agenda across the whole labour market, where production models are going. We've talked already about how difficult managing safety and health is in a home working context. That feels to me really important. And then the thing that slightly surprised me was the pay data, which I thought, well, for one, was the deviation across the group was very, very wide. So you had people getting quite substantial pay rises at one end, and you had a lot of pay freezes at the other. And particularly the pay freeze end was a surprise to me, because sort of average private sector pay increases in 2023 were sort of in the 6 to 8% rise range. Now, they've come down quite a lot this year with inflation. But I was surprised by the proportion of roles that didn't see a pay increase. Now, as a good recruiter, I always say, well, the quickest way to get a pay increase mid-career is to change your jobs. And there are many excellent REC members who are ready to help you do that. But there's something there about articulating the commercial value of good health and safety, and making sure that if companies are targeting pay rises because of limited budget, that skilled professionals like health and safety have a seat at that table.
I'm just going to read through some of the stats from the survey in relation to pay. So most of the respondents reported no increase in their pay in the preceding 12 months. And almost 30% had their pay frozen. And for those who did get an increase, the median was 3%. So So it seems that quite a few people are probably still feeling the squeeze, even though inflation is not as high as it was. So in terms of pay, do you think that situation is going to improve?
I'm afraid I'm a bit of a skeptic. I think, if anything, pay is trending the other way. It may be that the only thing that improves pay in this matter is market pressure. We went through a pay cycle where essentially the labour market demand of that boom in 2022 drove pay up in 21 into 22. 22 into 23, pay remained elevated as firms used their pay rounds in January and April 23 to catch their existing staff up to some of the offers they'd had to make to bring people in. The median's about 3% in an environment where the private sector is 6 to 8% on average. That's a sign that in that boom, health and safety didn't pick up with the crowd. I find it unlikely it's going to pick up from 3% when awards are coming down this year to sort of 3 to 4% in the private sector. So there's a real sense there of what's happened to cause that. And some of that might be about companies targeting their pay awards. Some of it might be about the sectoral split. Construction in particular has had a pretty tough time. Manufacturing has picked up a little bit, but wasn't as booming as some other sectors during 23. So maybe some of that fall behind isn't just about the profession; it's actually about where health and safety leaders are across the sectoral split, which is also, I think, a potential driver of the gender pay gap.
We'll come on to that a little bit later, but just looking at the data, it seems as if health and safety professionals are willing to move around because few of the respondents reported a long tenure in their jobs, in their current jobs, so less than a fifth had more than 10 years in post. So it seems as if, although the pay increases are not necessarily happening for OSH professionals, they are actually willing to move around. So that's something to watch out for, really.
Yeah, median term tenure, it's a great kind of truism of the British labour market that, we used to have jobs for life and we don't anymore. The truth is that average tenure in job in Britain hasn't really changed that much. And if you criticise younger workers for anything, they probably didn't change jobs enough in the last decade. Certainly that's the analysis the Resolution Foundation offers, because in your 20s you are meant to change jobs rapidly because that's how you get your salary up and you try things out and you find your path. That happened less in the last decade than it did in previous decades. Generally speaking, average tenure is about 6 to 7 years. I would expect health and safety professionals to behave more like, for instance, heads of IT or kind of heads of finance. So they're moving within their profession rather than within their sector necessarily. And therefore, if anything, the capacity to move more often is there. So I'm not that surprised by kind of relative lack of long tenure, although, I think 10 years in job now feels a long time in today's labour market.
Going to the gender pay gap. So this year's survey revealed a gap of £5,000 between men and women in favour of men, unsurprisingly. And actually that's greater than the last time we ran the survey, which was 2022. So it's a few £1,000s more than it was. What do you make of that? Does it fit with what you see more generally?
I think in general, the gender pay gap is coming down, but we have to understand the mechanics of how the gender pay gap works to think about what might be happening here. It's worth remembering the gender pay gap is the gap between average men and the average man and the average woman, rather than a specific measure of equal pay. So base effects colour it quite significantly. So if you have an older workforce in general, the gender pay gap might be a bit broader because they've walked through a labour market which was more gendered. So if you think about the preponderance of men in industries like manufacturing, if you think about some of the qualifications routes people go for. So a classic example in a discussion I had with the civil service a couple of years ago. If you say previous security clearance is helpful, okay, helpful, what do you mean by helpful? Well, it means I know it's going to be easier to get you security clearance for this job. Okay, look at your base of people who've been previously security cleared. They're vastly male. Similarly, putting an advantage onto people who've been in certain firms for their qualification or so forth. Those firms might be doing great things now, but were they doing great things 25 years ago? I remember the PwC study that was really worried about why they lost female accountants after motherhood, and motherhood is clearly one of the big drivers here. And they put loads into retaining people. The problem actually wasn't that mothers left PwC. Mothers and male workers at PwC left at the same rate. Mothers left at the same rate as non-mother female workers. What happened was when they replaced them, they just hired men because of the processes that were in place. So you've got to dig a bit deeper when it comes to the sources of the gender pay gap. I do think there's something around retention. I think retention for older female workers, where you have in general an older workforce. Point to the work that our colleague Helen Tomlinson has done as the government's menopause employment champion. There is a lot for companies to think about in terms of how you retain women in their 40s and 50s and early 60s, which is very different to the story for men. But there's also some societal things at work. One of the things we've noticed is grandparental stepping down. So the costs of childcare are so high that what happens when couples have children is that grandparents tend to step down in their careers, may either completely or 1 or 2 days a week, to cover childcare, to save cost for their kids, so that their kids can remain working full-time and building their careers. The preponderance of decision-making there is it's usually the grandma that steps down. So there's a whole slew of things about the infrastructure that exists around the workforce. It's why we put so much focus into things like childcare at the REC as infrastructure benefit to the UK labour force. So you're keeping your older female workers because you're investing in more in childcare, and things like public transport as well. One-car families, the bus cutbacks, and people's ability to get to work has been significant. So a whole slew of things that I think we can do as a society. And then as employers, we need to think about the position of female workers, retaining older female workers in an older demographic like safety and health, but also thinking about how we open up new pathways. And that's both a better gender mix in construction and in manufacturing, but it's also thinking about the profession as it broadens into, where people work now.
It's so interesting from an anthropological perspective to sort of unpick all these social factors going into gender pay gap and so on, and just the way people are working. Really fascinating stuff.
I think the biggest challenge we have, and you see this in the NHS workforce plan that was announced with great pizzazz last year, is we tend to do everything top down and not think of it as just about an agglomeration of of decisions that human beings make based on their perception of their best interests. So if you look at the NHS workforce plan, it's really focused on doctors and nurses. It's a bit 1950s, and it assumes that if we do this and that, then doctors and nurses will just decide. It's a bit like the apprenticeship levy, where apparently businesses would just decide to do massive numbers of apprenticeships because the government told them to. We need to be cleverer than that in how we make policy. And I think when it comes to issues like the gender pay gap, that is about supporting, in particular, women's decisions to get engaged with the sector, stay engaged with the sector, and thinking about the voices and the stories that, for instance, IOSH as a body puts onto the stage at the conference and highlights, so that we see we see a profession that is absolutely about not dropping molten steel on people, but is also about that home worker sitting at home, isolated, really feeling the weight on their mental health. Those are both really important. And I think that conception of the profession is something that I know IOSH has driven forward for a number of years, but we need to keep at it.
Mm. And do you think that we will ever get to a situation of, equal pay, or do you think women will always be tracking slightly below men?
I think we will close the gender pay gap. And I think we will close it when we have generationally moved on from the concept of women's work. And that will take a while, particularly because so much of it is not about the workplace, it's also about expectations in the home. But it's why childcare really matters. It's why flexible working really matters. And the great thing about this, with day one flexible working right to request coming in this year, the great thing about this is the rising tide lifts all boats. One of the things that I have appreciated as a working father is what the growth of flexible working has done for me, even though it disproportionately in aggregate benefits working mothers. It's been hugely good for me as a working father. It's also helped us rebalance things in what we do. And I think that will take time to play out. But I remain an optimist on the gender pay gap.
I'm glad you do.
I think some of this process is glacial. It really is. And some of the trade-offs are hard. But if you look at countries that have really committed to the infrastructure to support families, it's there. And maybe, at the risk of making a political point, for the last decade, working families have not been front and centre in political policy making. Lots of the decisions have been towards those whose assets come from wealth rather than income. Things like the pensions triple lock, lots of focus on older people. By comparison with the 2-child benefit cap, the cutbacks on child benefit, the kind of effect, the challenge in childcare, which government is now moving to address. I think actually there's a big workforce strategy for any incoming government that says, how do we help working age people, particularly working parents, to contribute economically? And what do we need to do to make that happen? Back when I was at the CBI 10 years ago now, we published a report that basically said if you invested in child care provision for every child in the country, you made money, because in particular mums stayed in the jobs they were doing. They didn't trade down for flexibility. Your gender pay gap closes, but actually your mums just pay a lot more tax. And last time I checked, the Treasury quite likes that. Mm-hmm. So there's a whole it's an aspect of this thing about us just being underinvested as a nation, in terms of the things which offer us long-term benefit.
So let's talk a bit about employee benefits. So things like final salary pensions are quite rare.
Yes.
Now.
Although ironically, now is the time that you'd want to have a final salary, because a final salary loves inflation.
So going back to our survey, final salaries, only 20% of respondents said they had one, and they were, of course, mostly in the older age groups. But 62% of our respondents said they benefit from hybrid or flexible working. So would you say hybrid or flexible working now is one of the employee benefits that's most valued? What's the kind of picture?
So I'm always slightly hesitant to talk about hybrid and flexible working as a benefit. It's a mode of production, and it's a mode of production that is probably more engaging to staff than come to London 5 days a week and slog in on the tube, or come to this factory in Ellesmere Port. But within that, I think to make it work, you need really good management. And it's interesting that one of the other findings in response to the survey was kind of managerial culture really matters to us. I think you can to do hybrid and flexible working well, you need a certain set of management skills applied consistently across the business, so that people stay engaged, so that people feel focused, so that people feel that they are supported in what they're doing. So those two things go hand in hand. But I do think it is important. And of course, from a corporate perspective, the challenge is making sure that you are doing things that allow people to give their best. And if that means a couple of mornings a week, I want to do the school run, and that means that I'll work from home those days, that's great. But it also means that you need that high trust environment where, let's be clear, you can't work from home if you've got a 2-year-old in the house with you and you're responsible for them. And we can't, as employers, that we can't accept that. And as employees, actually, we get an increasing sense in feedback from employees that other employees who don't pull their weight are dragging the hybrid working model down. So there's something there about needing to get really clear on the behaviours and expectations, and that's that good management. And if you can do that, absolutely, hybrid working has got huge benefits to staff.
And how much would you say something like corporate purpose matters to job seekers now?
I think it matters incredibly, and increasingly so for younger generations in the workforce. I think being able to articulate a public purpose as part of your commercial purpose is incredibly important. At the REC, we talk about making great work happen. What do our members do? They help companies to grow and create prosperity, and they open up opportunities to people. That's a really great and effective thing to be doing. And do we make a profit while we're doing that? Yes, of course we do, because that's part of the prosperity agenda. I think being able to articulate why you do what you do feels really important, especially when you are dealing, as we are here, with people for whom the purpose piece is right at the heart of things. The safe workplace is incredibly important. And I think it's becoming more important because of the potential reputation damage that companies can suffer over time. I think that C-suite executives are becoming more aware of those kinds of risks. I would argue that possibly the timescales are still too short term. My personal soapbox is reforming the British MBA agenda, curriculum, which is heavily weighted to being a finance director and not weighted enough to being the chief executive in terms of those people issues, safety issues, reputational issues. They're becoming more and more important.
So corporate purpose, it's increasingly something that matters. Obviously, salaries matter as well. We all have, rent to pay or mortgages to pay.
Yep.
So one question I have is in relation to the difference between the average salary for someone who is a member of a professional body and the average salary of a non-member. So our survey did, in fact, show there is a difference between members and non-members. So in our case, the difference was those who are not members tend to be paid about a fifth less than their counterparts. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, professional body membership does two things. One, self-evidently, it improves the skill set by engaging in CPD and in qualification and exams and so forth. And we say that repeatedly with our exams to recruiters too. But it's also a really clear signal. It's a mindset signal of I'm invested in building myself. But it's a signal in the market of rather than the way that we say to companies, use an REC member because they sign up to a code of conduct. There's a complaints process. If something goes wrong, you can come to us. We've got a professional standards body that has representatives of the CBI and the TUC on it that hears cases independently. The same is true with professional body membership. It's okay, this person's serious. And I think that does play through then to the types of roles people can access, but also the reward and value. And we're having this at the beginning of a labour market tightening cycle. We know that complex skill sets are in short demand. The sector that is still having real shortages, even now after a weakening year, is engineering. And in fact, temporary engineering vacancies are higher now than they were a year ago, which is completely counter to the rest of the market. Other specialist roles like health and safety, I suspect, will end up in the same place. Because of that, really clear signal about professionalism is likely to put wind in the sails of people who are looking for roles.
And do you see employers encouraging staff to work on their personal development?
Not enough. And I think that, I think skills has been a bit of a guilt-free whinge for British business. You know, if the colleges were any good, if the provision was any good, you've got to get in there and make it work. And what we're seeing where it really works is that where government stops handing down policy from on high, which is why the apprenticeship levy hasn't worked, and starts to engage with, what do you really need? But if we deliver it, you need to step up and play ball. We're seeing it work in Birmingham and the West Midlands with Andy Street's work. We're seeing it work in Manchester with Andy Burnham's work, where there's a clear economic strategy, clear engagement with skills providers, and a sense of a bully pulpit for firms where, you know, rather like in some Central European countries, you say, well, we're all in it together, but the only trouble is you're not, and why aren't you? So there's getting to that point where there's a bit of business peer pressure on firms to talk about professional development, I think is something we'd really like to work with governments across the UK on. And I think it will come as well because of the tightness in the labour market we're seeing. Good people practice is going to become more and more important.
That seems like a really good note to finish on, Neil. So thank you so much. It's been really interesting chatting to you. And thanks for joining us on IOSH Podcast.
Thank you, Joe. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for listening. Tune in again soon for more conversations on all things health and safety.